21st of December, 1944. The frozen ground around Bastogne shuddered beneath the weight of approaching armor, and Private First Class James Hendrix pressed his face against the ice-crusted earth. Listening, through the pre-dawn darkness came a sound that every American infantryman had learned to dread, the grinding mechanical howl of German tank treads chewing through snow and mud. They were close, perhaps half a mile out, and they were coming in force. Hendrix commanded what the Wehrmacht would have dismissed as worthless, a two-man bazooka team consisting of himself and his loader, Private Eugene Garrett, a rail-thin mechanic from Detroit who had never fired a weapon in anger before arriving in Belgium 6 days earlier. Their position was a shallow depression beside the Arlon Road, camouflaged with pine branches and backed by a stone wall that would provide exactly zero protection if a Panzer decided to roll over them. Behind them, perhaps 200 yards up the slope, the remnants of Team Cherry from the 10th Armored Division had dug in around Longvilly, establishing a defensive line that was supposed to anchor the southern approach to Bastogne. Was doing heavy lifting in that assessment. The line was paper-thin, undermanned, and facing German forces that outnumbered them by ratios that made careful tactical planning irrelevant. This would be about holding long enough for someone else to arrive, though who that someone might be remained unclear in the chaos of what was rapidly becoming the largest German offensive since 1940. Hendrix had been issued the M9A1 bazooka only 3 days earlier when his rifle company had been hastily reorganized to defend against the German breakthrough. The weapon rested beside him now, its metal tube cold enough to burn exposed skin, loaded with a single 2.36-inch rocket that Army Ordnance promised could penetrate up to 4 inches of armor plate under ideal conditions. What constituted ideal conditions was a question Hendrix suspected would be answered in the next few minutes, probably in ways that contradicted the optimistic claims made during training. Garrett huddled beside him with 4 additional rockets arranged in a canvas satchel, their warheads gleaming dully in the weak light filtering through the overcast sky. The kid's hands shook, though whether from cold or fear was impossible to determine. Probably both. The temperature had dropped to near 0 Fahrenheit overnight, and neither man possessed proper winter gear. They had stuffed newspapers inside their field jackets and wrapped burlap around their boots, improvised insulation that provided marginal protection against a cold that sought to kill as efficiently as any German shell. The mechanical grinding grew louder, resolving into individual sounds, the squeal of bogie wheels, the clatter of track links, the deeper rumble of multiple engines. Hendrix risked raising his head above the lip of their depression, and immediately wished he hadn't. Through the morning mist came shapes that materialized like something from a nightmare. German Panzers advancing in a staggered column along the road, supported by half-tracks carrying Panzer Grenadier infantry whose white winter camouflage made them nearly invisible against the snow-covered fields. He counted quickly. 14 tanks. The lead vehicles were Panzer IV mediums, their long 75mm guns traversing slowly as commanders scanned for threats. Behind them came heavier silhouettes that his recognition training identified as Panthers, 60-ton monsters mounting high-velocity cannons that could destroy any American tank at ranges exceeding a mile. The Wehrmacht was not probing the American line. They were preparing to smash through it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Garrett made a sound, somewhere between a whimper and a prayer. Hendrix couldn't fault him. Their tactical situation had just transitioned from desperate to suicidal. 2 men with a bazooka facing 14 Panzers was not combat. It was execution delayed by however long it took the Germans to notice them and respond. The rational decision would have been to abandon their position immediately, fall back to the main line, and report the enemy strength to someone with actual authority to do something about it. But rational decisions assumed that falling back was possible, and the German infantry, advancing alongside the tanks, had already moved past their position on both flanks. Hendrix and Garrett were cut off, surrounded by forces that hadn't yet noticed them, because the Germans were focused on the defensive line ahead. Moving now would draw attention. Staying meant becoming spectators to their own deaths. The third option, the one that violated every survival instinct Hendrix possessed, was to engage targets they couldn't possibly defeat and hope that delaying the German advance by even a few minutes might allow the men on the ridge to prepare for what was coming. Lieutenant Hajduk, their platoon commander, had been explicit during the chaotic briefing the previous night. Every minute counts. The division needs time to organize a coherent defense. If we can slow the Germans down, make them cautious, force them to deploy instead of simply rolling through our positions, we buy that time. No one had explained how infantry soldiers were supposed to make panzer commanders cautious, but Hendrix suspected his bazooka team was about to provide a practical demonstration of the concept. The lead Panzervier was 200 yards out now, well within the bazooka's effective range according to the manual, though Hendrix had learned during training that manual specifications and battlefield reality rarely aligned perfectly. The M9A1's rocket motor was notoriously sensitive to temperature variations, and launching a rocket that had spent the night in sub-freezing conditions was a gamble. The propellant might ignite normally, or it might burn irregularly, sending the rocket tumbling off course. The only way to know was to fire and hope physics cooperated. Hendrix tapped Garrett's shoulder twice, the prearranged signal that meant prepare to load. The kid nodded, fumbling with the canvas satchel to extract a spare rocket. His movements were clumsy with cold and fear, but he managed to position the rocket where Hendrix could reach it quickly after the first shot. If there was a second shot, if the Germans didn't locate them immediately and saturate their position with machine gun fire and high explosive shells, the range closed to 150 yards. Hendrix could see individual details now. The spare track links welded to the Panzer's hull as improvised armor, the commander visible in his open hatch, the bowgunner's machine gun protruding from the glacis plate. The tank was a Panzer IV OSFH, identifiable by its side skirts and long-barreled gun. German crews called them workhorses. American soldiers called them death traps when you were on the wrong end of their cannons. 125 yards. The Panzer's turret began traversing toward the American positions on the ridge, the gunner searching for targets. In perhaps 30 seconds, that gun would fire, sending a high-explosive shell screaming uphill to detonate among the scattered foxholes and hastily dug trenches where Hendrix's company mates waited. Men he had trained with, marched with, shared rations and cigarettes and lies about girlfriends back home. Men who would die if someone didn't do something to disrupt this textbook German advance. Hendrix rose to a kneeling position, the bazooka settling against his right shoulder. The weapon weighed 13 pounds, unloaded, but felt far heavier as he aligned the crude iron sights with the Panzer's hull. He aimed for the junction between turret and chassis, the turret ring where armor was thinnest and mechanical systems were vulnerable to penetration. His breathing slowed automatically, training overriding terror as his finger found the electrical trigger that would complete the circuit and ignite the rocket motor. The world contracted to this single moment. The Panzer, filling his sight picture, Garrett's ragged breathing beside him, the ache in his shoulders from holding the launcher steady, the absolute certainty that firing this weapon would mark their position and invite immediate retaliation. Hendrix had never considered himself particularly brave. He had been drafted, not volunteered, and his service record contained no commendations or decorations that suggested heroism. He was ordinary in every measurable way, a 22-year-old farmer's son from Iowa who had been harvesting corn 18 months earlier and now found himself holding a rocket launcher in Belgium, preparing to engage German armor. But ordinary men, confronted with extraordinary circumstances, sometimes discovered reserves they hadn't known existed. Not courage, exactly, but rather a stubborn refusal to accept that their deaths were inevitable, just because the odds suggested they were. Hendrix squeezed the trigger. The bazooka roared, belching flame and smoke from both ends as the rocket motor ignited. The backblast waves struck the stone wall behind them with enough force to dislodge chunks of frozen mortar, and the weapon's recoil drove into Hendrix's shoulder like a mule kick. The rocket streaked downrange on a tail of white smoke, crossing the distance in less than 2 seconds, and struck the Panzer's turret ring with a sharp metallic crack that echoed across the frozen fields. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the shaped charge detonated, focusing its explosive energy into a superheated jet of metal that punched through the armor plate and sprayed the interior with molten fragments. The effect was catastrophic. The Panzer lurched sideways as its driver instinctively tried to evade an attack that had already occurred. Black smoke began pouring from hatches as internal systems failed and ammunition ignited in a chain reaction that turned the crew compartment into a furnace. The commander attempted to bail out, but collapsed halfway through the hatch, his uniform on fire. The 2nd Panzer IV, traveling 20 yards behind the leader, ground to an emergency halt as its commander tried to identify the threat. That moment of confusion was exactly what Hendrix needed. Garrett had already loaded the 2nd rocket, his hands moving with mechanical efficiency despite the shaking. The German infantry squads began deploying from their half-tracks, spreading out across the fields in textbook assault formations. Machine gun fire erupted from multiple positions as the Panzer Grenadiers attempted to suppress whatever had just destroyed their lead tank. Bullets snapped overhead and kicked up frozen dirt around their depression, forcing Hendrix flat. The 2nd Panzer's turret swiveled, searching, and Hendrix knew with absolute certainty that the German gunner was seconds away from identifying their position and solving the problem with a 75mm high-explosive shell that would vaporize them and their bazooka simultaneously. He had, perhaps, 5 seconds before that happened. 5 seconds to aim, fire, and pray that the rocket flew true, and that God, or luck, or whatever force governed battlefield survival, granted them one more miracle. Hendrix fired his 2nd rocket at a range of 80 yards, close enough to see the German tank commander's face through the Panzer's cupola. The rocket struck the turret's side armor and detonated with the characteristic crack of a shaped charge penetrating steel. The explosion was less dramatic than the first kill, no secondary detonations or spectacular fires, but the result was equally effective. The Panzer ground to a halt, smoke wisping from its hatches as the crew bailed out into the snow. 2 German tanks destroyed in less than 30 seconds. The psychological impact on the remaining Panzer commanders was immediate and profound. The column, which had been advancing with the confidence of forces that had steamrolled through American positions for 5 days, suddenly fragmented as individual tank commanders made independent decisions about how to respond to the unexpected threat. Some accelerated, attempting to close the distance and overrun the American position through speed. Others halted and began traversing their turrets, searching for the source of fire. Garrett was fumbling with the 3rd rocket when a burst of machine gun fire stitched across their position, forcing both men flat against the frozen earth. Hendrix felt something hot score across his left shoulder and realized with distant surprise that he'd been hit. The wound was superficial, barely more than a deep graze, but it bled enthusiastically, and his arm immediately began to stiffen. He ignored it because the alternative was acknowledging that he'd been shot, and that acknowledgement might lead to shock or panic, or any of the psychological cascades that turn soldiers into casualties. The 3rd Panzer in the column had identified their position and was traversing its main gun with the deliberate precision of a gunner who knew he had a perfect shot. Hendrix could see the muzzle brake at the end of the 75mm cannon, a circular flash suppressor that would be the last thing he saw if the German gunner pulled his firing lever. In the next 3 seconds, Garrett screamed something incoherent and shoved the loaded bazooka into Hendrix's hands with enough force to nearly knock him over. Training took over, bypassing conscious thought. Hendrix shouldered the weapon, aimed at the Panzer's bow where the hull armor was thinnest, and fired without properly aligning the sights. The rocket flew on a trajectory that was more hope than ballistics, and Hendrix was already rolling sideways when it struck. The shaped charge punched through the glacis plate and detonated inside the crew compartment, where the transmission and ammunition storage occupied the same cramped space as the driver and bow gunner. The Panzer didn't burn. It simply stopped, its crew killed instantly by overpressure and fragmentation. 3 tanks destroyed, 11 remaining. The odds had improved marginally from completely impossible to merely suicidal. American artillery from the positions around Bastogne began falling among the German formation, belated fire support from observers who had finally identified the target. The shells were not particularly accurate, standard high-explosive rounds that created spectacular geysers of frozen earth, but rarely struck the armored vehicles directly. Their psychological impact, however, was significant. The German commanders, already unsettled by losing 3 tanks to an invisible bazooka team, now faced the additional complication of artillery fire that turned the road into a killing ground. The Panthers began backing up, their commanders reluctant to advance into what appeared to be a well-prepared American defensive position with interlocking fields of fire from anti-tank weapons and artillery. It was a logical tactical conclusion based on incomplete information. The reality was 2 half-frozen soldiers with a bazooka and 1 remaining rocket. But the Germans didn't know that, and in the confusion of combat, perception often mattered more than reality. Garrett was crying now, tears freezing on his cheeks as he loaded the 4th rocket with hands that shook so badly Hendrix wasn't sure the rocket would seat properly in the launcher tube. The kid had reached the psychological breaking point where terror overwhelmed training, where the body continued functioning through muscle memory even as the mind retreated from circumstances it could no longer process. Hendrix had seen it before in other soldiers. That moment when the facade of martial competence cracked to reveal the frightened boy underneath. A 4th Panzer appeared through the smoke and mist, advancing alone up a farm track that paralleled the main road. The tank commander had cleverly maneuvered to flank the American positions, using terrain folds and hedgerows to mask his movement. He was now perhaps 60 yards from Hendrix's position and approaching from an angle that would allow him to fire directly into the depression where the 2 Americans huddled. The German commander stood in his cupola, directing his driver with hand signals, confident that he'd identified the bazooka team's location and was about to eliminate the threat. Hendrix swung the bazooka around, the movement awkward because his wounded shoulder had stiffened to the point where raising his left arm sent lightning bolts of pain through his chest. The Panzer's turret was already traversing toward them, the gunner tracking the same target his commander had identified. This would be a race, measured in seconds. Could Hendrix aim and fire before the German gunner pulled his firing lever? The bazooka's iron sights settled on the Panzer's turret, the crude alignment barely adequate for precision shooting, but sufficient at this range. Hendrix's finger found the trigger and squeezed without allowing himself time to think about trajectories or armor angles or the 1,000 variables that separated successful shots from wasted rockets. The weapon roared, the backblast scorching the stone wall behind them, and the rocket flew true. The shaped charge struck the turret's side armor and penetrated, detonating inside where it ignited ammunition and turned the crew compartment into a blast furnace. The Panzer's hatches blew open, venting superheated gases and smoke, but no crew members emerged. They had died in the initial explosion, their lives extinguished in the microsecond between the rocket's impact and their brain's ability to process what was happening. 4 German tanks destroyed, 10 remaining, 0 rockets left. The bazooka was now a useless tube of metal, decorative rather than functional, and Hendrix let it drop from his numb fingers. He unslung his M1 Garand rifle, a weapon utterly inadequate against panzer armor, but at least capable of engaging the German infantry, who were now close enough that he could see individual faces. Then the ridge behind them erupted in flame as American tank destroyers that Hendrix hadn't known were present opened fire. The M10 Wolverines, essentially open-topped tank chassis mounting 3-inch guns, had been positioned in defilade behind the crest, invisible to the advancing Germans until they revealed themselves. Their first salvo struck 2 Panthers, armor-piercing rounds punching through frontal armor that should have been impenetrable and detonating ammunition racks in catastrophic explosions. The German advance staggered as commanders who had been focused on the Bazooka team suddenly faced a new and far more dangerous threat. The remaining Panthers began backing up, attempting to create distance where their superior guns could engage the American tank destroyers without exposing their thinner side armor. The Panzer Grenadier infantry, caught in the open without tank support, went to ground or began retreating toward their half-tracks. The tactical situation had reversed in seconds. What had been a German offensive was now a fighting withdrawal as American artillery intensified and more tank destroyers appeared along the ridgeline. The Wehrmacht forces that had confidently advanced, expecting to smash through token resistance, were instead facing a coordinated defense that, while thin and improvised, was concentrated enough to inflict unacceptable casualties. Lieutenant Hajduk appeared at the edge of Hendrix's depression, sliding down the slope with his carbine in one hand and a frantic expression on his face. He stared at the two soldiers, then at the 4 burning German tanks scattered across the approaches, then back at Hendrix, with an expression mixing disbelief and something approaching awe. The lieutenant opened his mouth to speak, closed it, tried again, and finally managed to ask the only question that mattered. "Are you hit?" Hendrix gestured vaguely at his shoulder where blood had soaked through his field jacket. Garrett remained unresponsive, staring at nothing, his mind temporarily absent from a reality it could no longer process. Hajduk called for a medic, then crouched beside Hendrix and asked the question that would appear in after-action reports and intelligence assessments. "How many tanks did you kill?" "4," Hendrix replied, his voice sounding distant and unfamiliar to his own ears. The lieutenant nodded slowly, processing information that contradicted everything his training had taught him about the capabilities of bazooka teams against massed armor. 4 tanks, destroyed by 2 men, was not supposed to be possible, yet the evidence burned across the frozen fields where smoke rose from destroyed Panzers and German wounded crawled through the snow, seeking medical attention that might not arrive in time to save them. A medic arrived and began examining Hendrix's shoulder wound with practiced efficiency, cutting away the blood-soaked uniform and irrigating the wound with sulfur powder before applying a pressure bandage. The medic worked without speaking, his movements economical and precise, the actions of someone who had treated hundreds of similar wounds and understood that conversation was a luxury wounded men rarely needed. Pain was beginning to assert itself, now that adrenaline was fading, a deep, throbbing ache that radiated from Hendrix's shoulder through his entire left side. Garrett remained catatonic, and the medic evaluated him briefly before signaling for stretcher bearers. The kid needed evacuation to an aid station, where someone with psychiatric training could determine whether his condition was temporary shock or something more profound and lasting. Combat produced psychological casualties as readily as physical ones, and the only difference was that psychological wounds bled internally where they couldn't be bandaged or sutured. The German attack along the Arlon Road had been stopped, or at least delayed, long enough for American forces to establish coherent defensive positions. The Panthers that had retreated would regroup and attack again, probably within hours, but they would do so cautiously, uncertain about what other surprises the Americans had prepared. That uncertainty, that hesitation, born from encountering unexpected resistance, was exactly what the defenders needed to buy time for reinforcements to arrive. The strategic situation surrounding Bastogne had deteriorated throughout the week following the German offensive's launch on the 16th of December. Hitler's plan, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, had achieved complete tactical surprise. American intelligence had dismissed the possibility of a major German offensive, assuming that Wehrmacht forces were too depleted and disorganized to mount strategic operations. That assumption proved catastrophically wrong when 28 German divisions, including elite panzer formations, erupted from the Ardennes forest and smashed into thinly held American positions. By the 21st of December, the offensive had created a bulge in Allied lines extending 50 miles west of the original front, a salient that threatened to unhinge the entire American position in Belgium and Luxembourg. Bastogne sat near the southern shoulder of that bulge, controlling 7 major roads that the Germans needed to sustain their westward drive. General Dwight Eisenhower had recognized Bastogne's importance immediately and ordered it held at all costs. The 101st Airborne Division, recuperating from the brutal fighting in Holland, received orders to load onto trucks and deploy to Bastogne with whatever equipment they could grab in the chaos of an army headquarters responding to crisis. They arrived just hours before German forces closed the ring, establishing a perimeter defense with a hodgepodge of airborne infantry, armored units separated from their parent divisions, artillery batteries, and support personnel pressed into service as riflemen. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe assumed command of the surrounded garrison and began organizing a defense that military analysts would later study as a textbook example of how determined forces could hold against superior numbers. That relief depended on General George Patton's Third Army executing one of the most complex maneuvers of the war, disengaging from offensive operations in the Saar region, pivoting 90 degrees north and attacking through winter weather into the southern flank of the German penetration. The fighting around Bastogne during those critical days before Patton's arrival had been desperate and confused. Small unit actions, like Hendrix's Bazooka team engagement, occurred at dozens of locations around the perimeter as American soldiers faced German attacks with whatever weapons they possessed. Some stands succeeded in stopping enemy advances, others failed, with positions overrun and defenders killed or captured. The cumulative effect was a defense that bent but never quite broke, that imposed delays measured in minutes and hours rather than days, but which in aggregate bought the time McAuliffe needed. Hendrix spent the following days in the aid station, his shoulder wound, preventing him from returning to frontline duty, but not serious enough to warrant evacuation. He watched as wounded men arrived in steady streams, casualties from the constant German probing attacks and artillery bombardments that sought to identify weak points in the American defenses. Some wounds were minor and treated quickly, and the soldiers returned to their units. Others were catastrophic, injuries that even the most skilled surgeons could not repair, and those men died on stretchers while medics moved on to patients who might survive. 22nd of December arrived with clearing skies, a meteorological development that transformed the tactical situation. For nearly a week, fog and low clouds had grounded Allied air forces, negating the overwhelming air superiority that normally made German movements suicidal. Now, with visibility improving, hundreds of Allied aircraft lifted from bases in France and England, carrying supplies for the besieged garrison and ordnance for the German forces surrounding it. C-47 transport aircraft flew supply missions directly over Bastogne, dropping parachute bundles containing ammunition, medical supplies, and food to the defenders below. Fighter bombers ranged across the battlefield, attacking German columns and supply depots with rockets and bombs. The psychological impact on German soldiers who had grown accustomed to operating without fear of air attack was profound. Inside Bastogne's shrinking perimeter, the arrival of supplies was greeted with relief that bordered on euphoria. Artillery batteries that had been rationing shells could now fire full missions. Medics who had been operating with inadequate supplies could properly treat the wounded. The garrison was still surrounded, still outnumbered, still fighting for survival, but the material situation had improved from desperate to merely critical. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 26th of December. The day that would determine Bastogne's fate dawned with crystalline clarity and brutal cold. Temperature had dropped to well below 0 Fahrenheit, turning the battlefield into a frozen landscape where exposed skin developed frostbite in minutes and vehicle engines refused to start without extensive preheating. But the cold also meant clear skies, and clear skies meant Allied air power could operate without restriction. South of Bastogne, Patton's 4th Armored Division was fighting through German defensive positions with the kind of relentless aggression that characterized Third Army operations. Combat Command B, led by Lieutenant Colonel Crichton Abrams, spearheaded the attack, advancing through villages that German forces had fortified and defended with professional competence. The fighting was brutal, close-quarters combat, where American tanks dueled with German anti-tank guns at ranges measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards. At approximately 4:50 in the afternoon, lead elements of Combat Command B made contact with forward positions of the 101st Airborne Division. The link-up was emotional chaos. Tankers and paratroopers embracing, shouting, sharing cigarettes and rations with the desperate enthusiasm of men who had survived something they hadn't expected to survive. The siege was broken. Not ended, but broken. A narrow corridor established through which supplies could flow and wounded could be evacuated. Inside Bastogne, news of the link-up spread rapidly, transmitted by radio and word of mouth through positions around the perimeter. Soldiers who had been fighting for a week with limited ammunition and dwindling hope suddenly found themselves part of a success story, a garrison that had held against overwhelming odds until relief arrived. The psychological impact was transformative. Exhausted men found reserves of energy. Wounded soldiers who had been contemplating whether they would survive suddenly focused on recovery. But the link-up did not end the fighting. The corridor connecting Bastogne to Third Army positions was narrow and vulnerable, constantly attacked by German forces attempting to re-establish the encirclement. Every supply convoy that tried to reach the town ran a gauntlet of artillery fire and tank ambushes. The defensive perimeter still required constant vigilance against German attacks that continued with desperate intensity. Hendrix's unit was among the first to receive ammunition resupply through the corridor, crates of bazooka rockets and rifle ammunition that arrived on trucks that had fought through German fire to deliver their cargo. He found himself staring at the rockets, remembering the engagement 6 days earlier that seemed simultaneously recent and impossibly distant. 4 rockets had destroyed 4 tanks and bought 15 minutes that contributed to a defense that had held long enough for Patton to arrive. The broader Battle of the Bulge continued into January of 1945 as Allied forces systematically reduced the German salient and pushed Wehrmacht units back to their starting positions. The offensive had consumed Germany's last strategic reserves without achieving any meaningful objectives. Hitler's gamble had failed catastrophically, leaving the Reich vulnerable to simultaneous offensives from east and west that would converge on Berlin within 4 months. Hendrix was awarded the Bronze Star for his actions on the 21st of December, a medal presented during a brief ceremony that felt surreal given the chaos of ongoing combat operations. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty, words that seemed simultaneously accurate and completely inadequate to describe 30 minutes of terror transformed into focused violence. He accepted the medal because refusing would have been inappropriate, but he felt no particular pride in the recognition. Garrett was eventually evacuated to a rear-area hospital in early January, once the corridor was secure enough to permit casualty evacuation. Hendrix never learned what became of him, whether the kid recovered from his psychological breakdown, or whether combat had permanently shattered something essential in his personality. The war produced such casualties by the thousands, soldiers whose bodies remained intact but whose minds could no longer process the violence they'd witnessed or inflicted. The defense of Bastogne had become iconic, a symbol of American determination and resilience that would be commemorated in books, films, and annual memorial ceremonies. General McAuliffe's response to the German surrender demand, his single-word reply of "nuts," entered military folklore as the perfect encapsulation of American character, irreverent, defiant, and utterly unwilling to accept defeat, regardless of tactical circumstances. For the soldiers who actually fought there, the mythology that grew around Bastogne was both gratifying and uncomfortable. They had indeed held against overwhelming odds, had indeed demonstrated courage and endurance that exceeded normal human limits, but the clean narrative of heroic defense that popular culture celebrated omitted the terror, the exhaustion, the random violence of artillery that killed without regard to courage or cowardice, the psychological cost of killing other human beings, even when that killing was tactically necessary and morally justified. Hendrix returned to the United States in July of 1945 after the German surrender, but before Japan's capitulation ended the war entirely. He was processed through a separation center that efficiently transformed him from soldier back to civilian, stripping away his uniform and identity and returning him to Iowa with a duffel bag of possessions and a head full of memories that civilian life seemed inadequate to comprehend. He resumed farming, married a woman named Dorothy, who had waited 3 years for his return, and raised 2 children who knew their father had fought in Europe but learned few details about what he'd experienced. The nightmares came irregularly throughout his life, not every night, but often enough that Dorothy learned to recognize the signs and wake him gently before the dreams became too intense. He never spoke about their content, and she knew better than to ask. Military analysts studied the engagement for decades, using Hendrix's action as a case study in effective use of anti-tank weapons and the importance of tactical positioning. Training instructors emphasized the lessons: select firing positions with cover and concealment, engage at ranges that maximize accuracy while minimizing exposure, aim for vulnerable points in enemy armor, and most critically, maintain psychological discipline under conditions of extreme stress where panic meant death. But no amount of analysis could fully capture the human dimension of those 30 minutes on the 21st of December, 1944. The statistics were clear: 4 German tanks destroyed by 2 American soldiers firing 4 Bazooka rockets. The tactical impact was measurable: 15 to 20 minutes of delay that allowed American tank destroyers to establish defensive positions. The strategic significance was debatable, but probably minor within the larger context of Bastogne's defense. What analysis missed was the individual experience of facing approaching Panzers with inadequate weapons and certain knowledge that death was probable, the feeling of a bazooka's recoil against an already wounded shoulder, the sound of shaped charges penetrating armor, and the screams of men dying inside steel coffins, the weight of having killed perhaps 20 German soldiers, young men who probably had families and hopes and fears indistinguishable from Hendrix's own, except for the accident of nationality and the ideology their government promoted. Hendrix lived to age 76, passing away in 1997 after a life that encompassed far more than one engagement in Belgium half a century earlier. His obituary in the local newspaper devoted 2 paragraphs to his military service, mentioning the Bronze Star, but not the specific action that earned it. Then discussed his decades as a successful farmer, his service on the county school board, and his reputation as someone who helped neighbors during difficult times without seeking recognition. Those who knew him best would say the war had shaped him, but not defined him, that he carried the weight of what he'd done with quiet dignity, and that he'd lived in ways that honored the second chance survival had granted. He never returned to Bastogne. Though he received invitations to anniversary commemorations, the idea of treating the place where he'd nearly died as a tourist destination felt wrong, disrespectful to the German soldiers he'd killed and the American comrades who hadn't survived. The Bazooka team's engagement near the Arlon Road became a footnote in the larger narrative of Bastogne's defense, which itself was one battle among thousands that comprised World War II. Yet, for the soldiers of Team Cherry, who watched 2 men hold a position against impossible odds, the engagement possessed absolute significance. They retreated to the ridge, established defensive positions, and survived to fight another day, specifically because Hendrix and Garrett had bought them the minutes necessary to prepare. Individual actions rippled outward in ways that strategic analysis couldn't fully capture, affecting outcomes at tactical, operational, and potentially strategic levels. The German Panzer column that was stopped on the 21st of December might have broken through American lines if Hendrix hadn't engaged them, might have reached Bastogne's road network hours earlier, might have altered the battle's trajectory in ways that cascaded through subsequent events. The Wehrmacht commanders who planned the attack along the Arlon Road had calculated that American forces would collapse when faced with massed armor supported by veteran infantry. Their intelligence suggested the defensive positions were thinly manned and inadequately equipped, easy obstacles to be swept aside during the advance toward more significant objectives. They had not accounted for the possibility that two soldiers with a bazooka might disrupt their entire operational timeline, might force caution where aggression was planned, might impose costs that made commanders reconsider whether immediate objectives were worth the casualties required to achieve them. Bastogne's defense validated the principle that armies composed of citizen soldiers who understood why they were fighting and trusted their own judgment could defeat professional military forces that possessed superior equipment and tactical training. The validation came at terrible cost, measured in thousands of casualties and months of suffering. But the principle endured. Free societies that trusted their soldiers to make decisions produced more effective military forces than authoritarian systems that demanded unquestioning obedience. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.